Emily, a young flight attendant, stood at the entrance of the plane greeting passengers as they boarded the flight from New York to Los Angeles. Her smile was wide and professional, but inside she was already counting down the hours until her shift was over. The bustle of people moving through the aisles and the sound of rolling luggage above her head seemed like a blur of routine. She had done this hundreds of times before the familiar motions of her job were second nature. She handed out boarding passes with a polite nod and made small talk with the regular travelers she had seen more than once. But it was always the same faces, the same conversations, the same greetings. The familiarity was comforting, but at times also numbing. She tried to shape the thought from her head, focusing on the task at hand. But then she noticed him, a man in his late 70s or early 80s, making his way down the aisle toward first class. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, as if he was trying to conserve energy. His grey hair was neatly combed, but the lines on his face told a story of years lived long and hard. He wore glasses perched on the edge of his nose, and carried himself with a quiet dignity that made him stand out among the other passengers. Most of them were talking, laughing, or already settling into their seats. But this man remained calm, almost too calm for his age. His eyes were sharp, and his gaze never wavered. As he moved down the aisle, Emily couldn't help but glance at him as he passed by. It was the kind of look someone would give if they had seen a lot in their time. Not the look of someone who was easily impressed, the kind of look that might make you think twice. But Emily didn't have time to think twice. She had a job to do, and she smiled politely as she handed him his boarding pass for first class. She noticed how steady his hands were as he took it from her, but she didn't think much of it. After all, elderly people were often steady and composed, even if they looked frail on the outside. Some were just used to the pace of life. She moved on to the next passengers, her mind drifting back to the responsibilities of the flight and the work that needed to be done. The flight attendants needed to ensure everyone was comfortable. Drinks were served, snacks were passed out, the announcements had to be made, the usual routine. But as she walked down the aisle to make sure everything was in order, Emily couldn't help but steal another glance at Mr. Thompson. His calmness seemed almost out of place. He was sitting in the first-class section now, and there was no indication that he was bothered by the flight in the least, not even a hint of anxiety. The plane was beginning to taxi down the runway, and the slight vibrations from the wheels on the tarmac seemed to rattle the other passengers. But Mr. Thompson remained still, not even flinching at the rumbling noise from the engines. Emily thought nothing more of it at first, focusing instead on the duties that required her attention. But a nagging feeling lingered at the back of her mind. Something about him seemed different. It was strange how still he was, how unaffected by the usual turbulence of air travel. But Emily dismissed the thought as she made her way to the front of the plane to prepare for takeoff. She couldn't afford distractions, especially with a full cabin of passengers. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that she had dealt with all sorts of passengers over the years. The calm, the frantic, the demanding, and the quiet. She was used to it. She had it under control. But even as the plane's engines roared to life and the ground beneath them began to shake, there was something about Mr. Thompson that she couldn't shake, something that tugged at her curiosity. As the plane ascended into the sky, Emily glanced toward him. Once more he had his eyes closed now, his face peaceful, as if he were in another world entirely this time. Though she didn't dismiss the thought, she lingered just for a second longer than usual, trying to read him, trying to figure out what was different about him. But she couldn't, and that was when the first hint of unease began to creep into her mind. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the familiar hum of the engines filled the cabin. As Emily moved through the aisles, checking on passengers, she offered drinks and snacks with a polite smile, but her mind was still half on Mr. Thompson. She couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off about him, the way he sat there so composed, while others were chattering around him, the way he didn't flinch when the plane took off, or when the seatbelt sign lit up. There was an air of quiet authority about him that made her uneasy. But Emily didn't have time to dwell on it. She had her job to do, and the rest of the passengers were more demanding than a quiet elderly man tucked away in first class. She made her rounds speaking to the regulars, asking if they needed anything, just the usual small talk that filled the space between announcements and safety checks. She checked on the rowdy group of college students near the back who were laughing too loudly and spilling their drinks, then moved up to a businessman who had buried himself in paperwork. When she reached the front of the cabin, Emily glanced again at Mr. Thompson. His hands rested on his lap, his posture still impeccable. He looked like he had never moved a muscle. Since boarding the plane, she felt a tug of curiosity and decided to approach him just to make sure he was comfortable. She stood next to his seat and offered a polite smile. "Mr. Thompson," she said softly, "is everything all right? Can I get you something to drink?" His eyes opened slowly, and he met her gaze. There was something in his eyes that sent a chill down her spine, something steady, like he had seen it all, and wasn't easily shaken. He nodded with a small smile and declined the drink as usual. Emily offered him a warm but brief response and moved on, but she couldn't quite shake the feeling that he was watching her more than he should have been. She brushed it off and continued her rounds, checking on the other passengers who were growing restless. As the flight continued, some were tired, others were starting to get anxious. It was then that the turbulence hit. Without warning, the plane suddenly lurched sideways, as if caught in the grip of a hidden storm outside. Emily's heart skipped a beat as the cabin filled with nervous passengers gripped their armrests. Some let out startled gasps. The seatbelt sign blinked on, and the intercom crackled with the captain's voice advising everyone to stay seated and fasten their seatbelts. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she quickly moved down the aisle, making sure everyone was following the instructions, her own heart racing with the sudden drop in the plane's altitude. The turbulence became stronger. The plane seemed to dip and sway with each gust of wind. The passengers' anxiety grew palpable. The rowdy students were now whispering to each other in fear. A mother was clutching her child, while a man near the back was holding on to the seat in front of him with white knuckles. Emily tried to keep her calm, but even her practiced smile was beginning to falter. She spoke reassuringly to the passengers around her as she checked each row, but her mind was already starting to slip into panic. What if the turbulence got worse? What if they weren't able to control the plane? She took a deep breath and told herself to stay focused. She had handled worse before. She had seen worse before. But this felt different. There was something about the intensity of the shaking that made her uneasy. She glanced toward Mr. Thompson. Again, this time, she saw him with his hands still resting calmly on his lap, his face unchanged, his eyes locked on her for a brief moment. She thought she saw something flicker in his gaze, something almost knowing. But before she could process it, the plane dipped again, throwing her off balance. She quickly steadied herself and moved to the back of the cabin, where the turbulence was hitting hardest. The passengers were all tense. Some were clutching the armrests, others had their eyes shut tight. But through it all there was Mr. Thompson, still sitting still, no sign of distress, no change in his demeanor. The more Emily thought about it, the more confused she became. How could he be so calm? She had never seen anything like this before. The elderly often struggled with anxiety during turbulence, but Mr. Thompson was different. There was something about him that felt too composed, almost like he was waiting for something. The turbulence worsened, and the plane bucked violently from side to side. The lights above flickered for a moment, sending a ripple of nervousness through the passengers. A few screamed, others clutched their seatbelts tighter. The plane's sudden movements made it feel as though the ground beneath them was shifting, but amidst the chaos, Emily's eyes kept returning to Mr. Thompson. He was still sitting perfectly still, his hands resting calmly on his lap. His gaze was fixed ahead, and his face remained impassive. The unsettling stillness in his posture was impossible to ignore. It was as if the storm outside didn't exist to him, as if he were in a completely different reality from the rest of the passengers, who were visibly frightened. She couldn't help herself and glanced at him again, this time trying to make sense of what she was seeing. His expression was so composed it almost looked rehearsed, like someone who had experienced much worse than this, and had long since lost the capacity to be affected by something so trivial as turbulence. Emily's thoughts raced. She couldn't figure it out. This was the worst turbulence she had experienced in a long time. Passengers were panicking, but Mr. Thompson was as calm as ever. Was he sick? Was there something wrong with him? Was he simply too frail to care about the storm shaking the plane? Or was it something else altogether? She felt her breath quicken as another wave of turbulence slammed into the plane. She stumbled for a moment, trying to regain her balance. As she moved down the aisle, checking on the passengers, she was doing her best to stay composed, but the shaking was relentless. The plane's jerking motions were making it harder and harder to keep her mind in the present. Every time she thought it might be over, another jolt would send her into a brief panic. She noticed the passengers around her, now visibly shaken, some of them with their hands gripped tightly on the seat in front of them. Some were muttering prayers under their breath. Others sat with their eyes squeezed shut, as if trying to block out the reality of what was happening. But still there was Mr. Thompson, sitting without a hint of fear, his back straight, his hands unmoving in his lap. Emily began to feel a small knot form in her stomach. It wasn't just curiosity. Now it was concern. What was this man's secret? Why was he not afraid? This didn't make sense. Not for someone of his age. He was a senior man, frail and quiet. He should have been just as rattled by the turbulence as the rest of them. But instead, he seemed untouched by it all. And it made her uneasy in a way she couldn't explain. The captain's voice finally crackled over the intercom again, giving the passengers a brief update. The turbulence was expected to last a few more minutes, and everyone needed to remain seated and calm. As soon as the announcement ended, Emily was on her way back to the front of the plane. She was trying to calm her own nerves, but she couldn't help but glance back at Mr. Thompson. Once more she felt an overwhelming need to check on him, to see if he was truly okay. Was he sleeping? Was he even aware of what was happening? But when her gaze landed on him, he was still the same as before, motionless. His eyes remained closed, and his expression unreadable. Emily stopped in her tracks, unsure of what to do next. She should check on him, right? Maybe he needed assistance. But something in her gut told her not to approach, not yet. She hesitated, her eyes fixed on him for a long moment before she turned away, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to focus on the other passengers to distract herself, but she couldn't get the image of Mr. Thompson out of her mind. There was something unnerving about his unshakable calm. It felt like he was waiting for something, like he knew exactly what was going to happen next. And that thought unsettled her more than the turbulence itself. As the plane shook again, she forced herself to concentrate on her duties, moving up and down the aisles, checking on the others. But every time the plane dipped or shook, she found herself glancing at Mr. Thompson again and again. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, and with each glance the unease in her chest grew heavier. The turbulence seemed to stretch on forever. The plane jolted up and down with each passing moment, and each time it dipped, Emily's stomach dropped a little more. She found herself gripping the armrests of the nearest seats just to keep steady. The vibrations from the plane's movement rattled her nerves, and she couldn't stop herself from looking at Mr. Thompson again. The way he remained so still was starting to feel unnatural. No one else on the plane was behaving like this. Not even the most experienced flyers among the passengers seemed so at ease. It was almost as though he were immune to the chaos around him. He hadn't shifted once in his seat, not a single flinch, not a single movement. Since the turbulence began, she couldn't explain it. And it was starting to get to her. Her mind was racing, and the more she tried to focus on her duties, the more her eyes kept flicking back toward him. She was trying to ignore it, but the unsettling feeling grew stronger. as the minutes dragged on. Each jolt from the plane seemed to accentuate the strange stillness of Mr. Thompson. He was like a rock in the middle of a storm. But rocks didn't feel fear or discomfort, did they? And yet there was something about him that made her uneasy. Her own fear was intensifying as the turbulence shook the plane with even more force. Passengers around her were starting to panic now. Some were clutching their seatbelts, others had their hands gripped tightly to the armrests, their eyes wide with fear. Emily was trying to keep her composure as she moved through the aisles, but the energy in the cabin was getting harder to ignore. The noise of worried whispers and nervous gasps filled the air. The sound of a baby crying in the back added to the growing tension. A woman near the front was clutching the hand of her husband, whispering assurances that things would be okay. Emily gave them both a comforting smile, but her own unease was starting to show through despite her efforts to hide it. She could feel her heart racing, her mind clouded with worry, and she couldn't help but wonder if this was just the beginning of something worse. How much longer would the turbulence last? How bad would it get? And still there was Mr. Thompson sitting calmly as ever. His eyes remained closed, his face relaxed, as though he were asleep and completely unaffected by the chaos that had consumed the cabin. Emily moved toward the back of the plane to check on the rowdy college students who had settled down somewhat, but were still whispering nervously amongst themselves. She reassured them, but couldn't help but feel the weight of her own anxiety pressing down on her. She glanced at the clock overhead. They had been in the air for over an hour now. The turbulence was showing no sign of letting up, and the unsettling stillness of Mr. Thompson was starting to consume her thoughts more and more. The more she thought about it, the more confused she became. She had never seen anyone handle turbulence like this before. It didn't make sense. Why wasn't he scared? Why wasn't he reacting like everyone else? Her mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, but none seemed to fit. He was elderly, frail even, but there was something about him that was so composed, so unwavering. It was starting to make her feel like she was losing control of the situation, like there was something she was missing, something important. Her heart began to pound harder as she passed by Mr. Thompson. Again, her breath shallow, as she tried to ignore the overwhelming feeling that was starting to rise in her chest. She took a deep breath as she walked past him, but her eyes lingered on him for just a moment too long, and that's when she saw it just for a second. His eyes opened slowly. They met hers with a calmness that was almost unnerving. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes was enough to send a chill down her spine. He knew something she didn't, and the moment their gazes locked, she felt as though she had been seen through, like he was somehow aware of every thought she was having. She quickly turned away, not wanting him to see the unease that was creeping into her own expression. She moved toward the front of the cabin, trying to focus on something, anything else. But her mind was still on him, still on his unshakable composure, still on the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. But what was it? What was he hiding? Or was it something else entirely? The turbulence seemed to come in waves, each new jolt more intense than the last. Emily's pulse raced as she moved through the cabin, trying to keep her composure. But it was becoming harder with every passing moment. The uneasy feeling in her chest was growing as she kept stealing glances at Mr. Thompson. His stillness was almost unbearable. It wasn't normal. No one could stay that calm in the middle of a storm like this, not unless they were hiding something, or they simply didn't care at all. But Emily couldn't understand why someone would act like that. She had worked on flights with all kinds of passengers, the anxious ones, the seasoned travelers, the brave ones, and the scared ones. But Miss Thompson was different. He wasn't reacting like any of them at all. It was unsettling, almost unnerving. She had never felt this way about a passenger before. As she walked through the aisles, she noticed the fear in the eyes of the other passengers, the fear in her own chest. The plane felt like it was being tossed around in the air with no control. And yet there was Miss Thompson sitting as still as ever, his hands resting on his lap, his eyes closed as if the chaos outside didn't exist. Emily couldn't help herself. She found herself walking back toward him again this time. She stood there for a moment longer than she had before. She didn't know what she was looking for. But there was something about him, something that felt like a puzzle she couldn't solve. She stared at him for a long moment. His face was peaceful calm, his breathing slow and steady. There was no sign of distress, no sign that he was affected by the turbulence. At all, it almost felt like he was observing the chaos instead of being a part of it. The thought made her shiver just slightly. She cleared her throat softly. As she stood there, still unsure of what to do, Miss Thompson, she said quietly, "Are you sure you're okay? Is there anything I can get for you?" But there was no response. He didn't move a muscle. He didn't open his eyes or acknowledge her. In any way, it was as though he hadn't even heard her speak. Emily took a step back, her heart racing now. She tried to remind herself that he was just an elderly man, and maybe he was used to turbulence. Maybe he had flown enough times to be completely unfazed by it. But even as she told herself this, the nagging feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. It only grew stronger. It was like a weight pressing down on her. The longer she stood there, the more she felt like she was missing something big. She couldn't explain it. But it felt like there was more to him than met the eye. She turned away from him finally and started walking toward the back of the plane. But her thoughts kept drifting back to Miss Thompson, the way he sat so still, the way he never flinched, not once, despite the increasing intensity of the turbulence. Emily glanced back again. But this time something was different. She didn't know what had changed. But it was as if the air around him had shifted. There was an energy in the way he held himself. It wasn't just calmness, it was something else. It was power, an undeniable authority. She stopped in her tracks and felt her breath catch in her throat. It was like something clicked in her mind, something that she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge before. And that realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This man wasn't just an elderly passenger. He wasn't just someone who happened to be sitting there and waiting for the turbulence to pass. No, there was something far more profound about him, something she couldn't ignore anymore. And that realization made her feel uneasy in ways she couldn't fully understand. It felt as if the very presence of Miss Thompson was a test of some kind, and she wasn't sure if she was passing it or failing it. And in that moment of doubt, Emily knew that the truth she was starting to suspect was far bigger than anything she could have imagined. The realization about Mr. Thompson sat heavily in Emily's mind, like a weight she couldn't shake. Every time she glanced at him, something in her gut told her she was missing something important. But she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The turbulence was still relentless, and now the plane seemed to be shaking even harder, as though the storm outside was growing in intensity. The lights flickered again, sending a ripple of anxiety through the cabin. Emily felt a wave of dread wash over her as she looked down the aisle toward Miss Thompson. His stillness was almost more unnerving. Now that she was questioning him, was he just an elderly man who had lived a long life? Or was there something more behind his calm exterior? What was he hiding? She wanted to ask him so badly, to find out what made him so different. But every time she approached him, the words stuck in her throat. It wasn't like her to feel this unsure of herself. But there was something about this passenger that made her feel as though she were walking a tightrope. She had to keep moving, though she had to focus on her duties. She couldn't let herself become consumed by the thoughts swirling in her head. But as she made her way down the aisles again, she found herself looking at him once more. Something about him called to her. It was like a magnetic pull that she couldn't resist. She was drawn to him. Even though every instinct inside her screamed to stay away, the plane shook again with such force that it nearly threw her off balance, and the passengers around her began to react once more. A couple of them gasped, others gripped their armrests tightly. Emily felt the panic beginning to creep in. But once again she glanced at Miss Thompson. He was still seated the same way as before, his face serene, his eyes closed, and his hands rested quietly on his lap. It was like he was in another world entirely. But just then the plane dipped hard, almost as if it were falling, and the sudden drop sent a few passengers into a frenzy. Screams filled the cabin. The lights flickered once more. The plane shuddered violently. And in that moment, everything seemed to freeze. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The sound of her own heartbeat was loud in her ears. The chaotic noise of panicked passengers faded for a moment, and all she could hear was the low hum of the engines and the sounds of the air around her. But what really caught her attention was Miss Thompson for the first time. Since the turbulence started, he moved his eyes open slowly, and he looked right at her for a long moment. Their gazes locked, and Emily felt as though she were staring into something far deeper than just the eyes of an elderly man. She felt exposed, like he could see straight through her thoughts, straight into her soul. His eyes were calm. But there was something there, something hidden behind them. She couldn't explain it, and she didn't know what it meant. But the longer they held each other's gaze, the more unsettled she felt. The seconds seemed to stretch on forever, as if time itself had slowed down. His eyes didn't blink. They just watched her in a way that made her feel small and insignificant, like she wasn't in control anymore, like the world had shifted somehow. And she was no longer the one guiding the flight. The turbulence hit again, harder this time, and the shaking of the plane snapped her out of her daze. The sudden shift jolted her back to reality. She stumbled forward, almost losing her balance, and her hands shot out to grab onto the nearest seat to steady herself. The world around her seemed to spin, but it was only for a moment. She quickly regained her composure and forced herself to focus on the passengers again. She needed to get them under control. She couldn't let the panic spread. But as she walked down the aisle, her mind was still on Miss Thompson. His gaze still burned in her memory, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen, something that involved him. But what was it? What did he know that she didn't? The answer was just out of reach, and the feeling of dread only grew stronger as she moved through the cabin. The turbulence was getting worse. The passengers were getting more frightened, and all Emily could do was push her growing fears to the back of her mind. But the truth was, she had never felt more afraid in her entire career, because she knew deep down that the calmness of Miss Thompson wasn't just strange, it was a warning. And she was beginning to fear that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing inside that plane. The plane shook harder and harder, as though the storm outside had reached its peak. The passengers were now in a full panic. Some were praying, others were crying, clutching their loved ones tight. Emily was trying to keep control of the situation, but she felt like the chaos around her was swallowing her whole. The turbulence was relentless, and it seemed as though the plane was in the grip of something far more dangerous than just bad weather. The shaking had become unbearable. Now she could barely keep her footing as she walked down the aisle. The noise of terrified voices filled the cabin, and it made her own heart race faster. But through it all there was Miss Thompson, still seated, as calm as ever, his posture unmoved, his face still unreadable. His eyes never left her, and she could feel the weight of his gaze upon her. Even as she tried to look away, there was something in the way he stared at her that felt like a warning, a message she couldn't understand, but couldn't ignore. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt like there was something about to happen, something that would change everything. Something terrible was coming, and it involved him. Emily could feel the panic rising inside her chest. As the turbulence worsened, she tried to focus on the other passengers, trying to keep them calm, but her thoughts kept drifting back to him, back to Miss Thompson, and that eerie calmness that seemed so out of place. She tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. He was becoming a magnet for her attention. Every time she looked at him, she felt that sinking feeling in her stomach grow worse. Something was happening, something she couldn't explain, but it felt real. The sense of dread was overwhelming now. As the plane shook violently once again, she found herself at the front of the cabin, gripping the side of the seat to steady herself. She took a deep breath and forced herself to focus on the tasks at hand, checking on passengers, telling them to remain seated, assuring them that the turbulence would end soon. But the words felt hollow in her mouth. They didn't calm anyone down. The fear was palpable, and it was spreading like wildfire. The panic had become contagious, and it was starting to overwhelm Emily too. The turbulence struck again, and the plane lurched downward with a force that sent several people gasping and clutching their seats. Emily's own breath hitched as she nearly lost her balance. She had never felt turbulence like this. Before, it was like the plane was being tossed around by an invisible force that had no intention of letting go. Her grip tightened on the seat, and she steadied herself just in time to see a flash of light. From the window, the sky outside was dark and stormy, but for a brief moment she saw a flash of lightning that lit up the clouds. The light outside illuminated the cabin, just enough for her to see the faces of the passengers, panic-stricken and desperate. But still there was Miss Thompson sitting in his seat, unshaken, unaffected by the chaos around him. His eyes were locked on hers, and in that brief moment something shifted in the air. It was like a wave of cold that washed over her, as though she had just crossed an invisible line she couldn't see, but she could feel it deep in her bones. It was like the world had tilted ever so slightly, and she was suddenly aware of a presence in the cabin that was not of the normal world. It was as if the storm outside had somehow merged with the storm within the plane, and everything was heading toward a breaking point. Emily took a step back, her chest tight with fear. She tried to speak to the passengers to calm them down, but her voice felt small in the face of the fear that was building in the cabin. The rumbling of the plane echoed in her ears, and the plane bucked again, sending a fresh wave of panic through the passengers. Emily's heart was pounding now. She could hardly breathe, and she couldn't stop looking at Miss Thompson. The calmness in his eyes felt like a challenge, like he knew something she didn't, something she wasn't ready to face. The flashing lightning outside, the deep rumble of the plane, and the steady gaze of Miss Thompson all came together to form something that felt inevitable, like there was no escape from what was coming. The storm inside the cabin was just the beginning of something far darker, and Emily knew deep down that once it started she wouldn't be able to stop it. But what was it? What did Miss Thompson know? Why was he the only one unaffected by the madness around them? The plane seemed to tremble in the air, the turbulence unrelenting, as though the storm outside had found its way into the very bones of the aircraft. The lights flickered again, but this time they didn't come back on. The cabin was cast in an eerie half-darkness. The silence inside was oppressive, save for the sound of panicked breathing and the soft whispers of worried passengers. Emily could feel the weight of the fear pressing down on her shoulders. It was suffocating. She moved through the aisles, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that something was lurking just beyond the edge of her understanding. The storm outside had become a monstrous roar, and every so often the plane would dip or shudder violently, throwing the passengers into a fresh wave of panic. But still there was Miss Thompson, sitting as calm as ever, his hands resting gently on his lap, his eyes locked on hers without so much as a blink. There was something in his gaze now that made Emily's blood run cold. It wasn't just calmness anymore. It was knowing and unspoken understanding that left her feeling like she was the one caught in the storm, not the plane, not the passengers. But her, it was like he had seen this moment unfold 1,000 times before, and now he was just waiting for the inevitable to happen. But what was it? What was he waiting for? Emily could barely think straight. The fear and confusion were overwhelming. The plane lurched again, this time even harder. The sound of metal groaning under the strain echoed through the cabin, and several passengers cried out in fear. Emily reached for the nearest seat to steady herself. Her palms sweating, she looked toward the front of the cabin again, toward Miss Thompson, who hadn't moved an inch, not even when the plane rocked with the force of the storm outside. But this time, when she looked at him, she felt something shift, something change in the air. It was like the whole atmosphere had changed, and she could feel it crawling beneath her skin. It was as though the turbulence wasn't the cause of the chaos anymore. It was the symptom of something far worse. She had a terrible thought, one that she couldn't ignore. It was as if a switch had been flipped deep within her mind, and she realized that the storm wasn't just the weather, it wasn't just the turbulence, it was Miss Thompson. The calmness in his eyes now felt like a threat. and she couldn't explain why, but the tension in the air had become unbearable. He wasn't just an elderly man sitting quietly. He wasn't just a passenger who had somehow mastered his fear. No, there was something far more sinister about him, something that had been there all along, something that had been hiding in plain sight. Emily took a step back, her breath shallow, her heart racing. She felt like she was drowning in the weight of the realization that had hit her so suddenly. What was he? Was he responsible for this? Was it possible that the chaos outside was somehow connected to him? Could he control the storm? Could he be the cause of it? Was it possible that the turbulence wasn't just bad luck, but a sign that something was about to go horribly wrong? Her mind raced with questions. None of them made sense. But the more she thought about it, the more she was sure of one thing: the truth about Miss Thompson was more than she could handle, more than she wanted to know. She glanced around at the other passengers, their faces pale with fear, their hands clutching anything they could hold on to, and in the middle of it all there was Miss Thompson, still staring at her, unblinking. It was like he knew she had figured it out. He knew she had uncovered something that she wasn't supposed to know. But how much did he really know? How far did his control go? Was he just playing a part in this terrifying situation? Or was he the mastermind behind it all? The plane shuddered once more, and this time Emily felt the shift in the air more acutely than before. It was as though the entire cabin had shifted with it. The turbulence wasn't just the storm outside, it was inside now too. And it wasn't going to stop until something else changed, something bigger, something darker. Emily's eyes darted back to Miss Thompson, and in that moment she realized what it was. It wasn't that he was calm, it was that he was waiting for her to figure it out, waiting for the storm to break, waiting for the moment when everything would change. And as the plane dipped once more, sending a fresh wave of panic through the cabin, Emily knew that the worst was still yet to come. And whatever happened next, Miss Thompson was at the center of it all. She just wasn't sure if she was ready to face the truth about him, or if she would even survive it.